It's a real pleasure to be here. I don't think I ever thought I would be speaking in the Romanian Parliament. I once spoke in the French Assemblée Nationale in an event like this, but it's a great pleasure to be here. And many thanks to Mihail and Neamtu for making things possible. Before I speak specifically about Solzhenitsyn, I want to say a word about my new book, a new book in Romania, The Idol of Our Age. This book is very much directed against what I see as the reigning secular religion of our age. And that reigning secular religion of our age has a name. It was given a name by an eccentric, brilliant, and deeply problematic French philosopher and social scientist by the name of Auguste Comte. And Comte, writing in the 1840s and 50s, he spoke about how very much, a certain kind of thinker is very interested and invested in this idea that history has an internal logic, and Marxism, of course, is a deeply pernicious example of that. But Comte argued that there were three great ages of humanity. The first was the metaphysical, the religious age, and he had associated religion with primitivism, with superstitious. Then there was a new age that he called the metaphysical age, where human beings were preoccupied with the great questions about human meaning and destiny. Is there a God? Why is there something rather than nothing? But Comte thought, rather like Marx, that those questions were finally futile. And lastly, Comte said, we live in a new age, the age of positive reason and science. And in the age of positive science and reason, we no longer ask those questions. Except Comte was complicated because he thought human beings were still religious animals. And so one needed to invent a substitute religion, a humanitarian religion that would satisfy the religious needs of human beings while abolishing religion. So religion belonged to the past. It had been superseded by a new science of humanity. But Comte, who was a bizarre, if deeply clever man, actually came up with a catechism of the religion of humanity. And great philosophers and scientists and atheists had their own feast days. And even some inventors of the old religions had feast days. The only person who didn't have a feast day on the new positivist calendar was Jesus Christ. And Comte called himself, anointed himself in 1851, outside of Notre Dame Cathedral, the high priest of the religion of humanity. He invited the Tsar, the Pope, the head of the Jesuits. Not surprisingly, none of them came. One country took Comte up on his challenge, and that was Brazil. If you look at the flag of Brazil, order and progress, that's the symbols of the Comtean movement. So why am I mentioning Comte? Because in some practical way, as bizarre as this religion of humanity, its faith in technical expertise, Comte was the first philosopher to speak of altruism, which is not Christian charity. It's a kind of fellow feeling that can be applied in every direction. Comte spoke about l'humanité. We feel for the world. We're citizens of the world. The old nations are obsolete. So Comteanism had a practical political bearing in saying that the old classical and Christian truths were definitively left behind, but it also had a political bearing that the nations were to be left alive. And so I would suggest since 1989, with the collapse of European totalitarianism, that instead of an authentic rebirth of classical reason, classical religion, you might say the full range of the goods of the mind and soul, many people, including people in the churches, have been tempted by this substitute religion. It's, yeah.
Ok, am să fac foarte rapid o succintă traducere a celor spuse de profesorul Mahoney, care pleacă, evident, ca orice filozof, de la convingerea că ideile au consecințe. Și ideile care au marcat, mai ales Europa Occidentală, după Revoluția franceză, ideile, de pildă, care l-au pus în prim planul culturii franceze și europene pe Auguste Comte, sunt următoarele. Prima idee pe care el a avut-o și care a circulat foarte mult a fost că epoca religioasă a fost o epocă a superstițiilor. Toți cei care mai credeau în miracole, care credeau că mersul la biserică îți face bine, erau niște oameni oarecum lipsiți de raționalitate. Și această epocă, din fericire pentru Comte și pentru alți gânditori ca el, a fost depășită prin intervenția gândirii critice, filozofice, care punea altfel de întrebări, nu legate de suflet, cât poate de sensul lumii, într-o dimensiune, dacă vreți, cosmologică, filozofia în caută o emancipare față de Dumnezeu. Apoi, după ce întrebările religioase și cele filozofice dispar, apare epoca rațiunii, a științei care ea are toate răspunsurile și care, epocă a rațiunii, foarte interesant, vine cu o propunere. Așa cum avem, asta e parafraza mea, înlocuitor, după cum știți, pentru zahăr, de pildă, inclusiv în băutura domnului Mahoney, avem și un înlocuitor bun pentru religie. Și acest înlocuitor pentru religia tradițională creștină este umanitarismul secular ateu. În ce constă acest umanitarism ateu? Nu seamănă cu cel creștin. În această încredere absolută în experții care, mai ales în perioada de criză, cum a fost perioada COVID, vin cu soluții. Spre deosebire de preoți, spre deosebire de oameni religioși, ei, experții care știu ce este știința, aici o să ne ajute profesorul Cârstea să înțelegem mai bine, ei vin și ne propun o înlocuire a religiei tradiționale cu acest cult al rațiunii. De altfel, exista și un fel de calendar al acestei noi religii. Omul, doamnelor și domnilor, în noua ipostază, omul este tratat ca un fel de cetățean al planetei, care nu mai are niciun fel de atașament față de națiunile individuale particulare, nu mai ține de orașul său, de obârșia sa, de cultura locală, ci ține doar de un soi de, să spunem, set general de valori al umanității. Această generalitate la care se raportează globaliștii astăzi are o rădăcină în, spuneam, religia lui Auguste Comte. Când vorbim de globalism, să nu uităm, ne raportăm la o filozofie care are niște rădăcini în secolul XIX, umanitarismul ateu al lui Auguste Comte.
So let's turn to 1989. You know, of course, there was a temptation on the part of some to interpret the collapse of, or the, yeah, I guess we say the collapse of European totalitarianism as the end of history, which was silly in a way. You know, that the political problem, the human problem, the moral problem had been solved with the collapse of one of the most virulent political religions of the age. But, you know, I think in the East Central Europe, on this side of the former Iron Curtain, there was a tremendous pressure to interpret Westernization and modernization in a broadly secularist and Comtean way. In other words, instead of looking to the lessons that could be discerned from the totalitarian experience or episode, the thought was to be truly modern and Western, we need to leave behind not only the inhuman totalitarianism of Marxist Leninism, Stalinism, etc. We have to leave behind the old Europe, the old verities, etc. But what's interesting about, let's say, two thinkers that are near and dear to my heart, Fyodor Dostoevsky and Solzhenitsyn, they saw, Dostoevsky saw it in the 19th century, Solzhenitsyn saw it up front through direct human experience in the 20th. They saw that the two nihilisms were very much connected. the kind of soulless utilitarianism, the scientism that denied the reality of the human soul, of moral agency and free will. You read a book like The Demons, Biesi by Dostoevsky. The radical nihilists, the revolutionary terrorists are also adherents of a kind of reductive materialism and scientism that explains the human person and the human soul away. And what's remarkable about Alexander Solzhenitsyn, when he was arrested as a captain in the Red Army in East Prussia in February 1945, he was no fan of Stalin, but he thought of himself as a Marxist-Leninist. And in the camps, the scales of ideology fell from his eyes. And gradually, of course, over time, he had to return to a robust religious affirmation. But what Solzhenitsyn discovered first and foremost in the camps were certain elemental but indispensable spiritual truths. And those truths had to do primarily with the permanent drama between good and evil in every human soul. That the fundamental conflict lay not between nations, parties, states, regimes, ideology, but the concrete choice for moral responsibility, for a conscientious adherence to the moral law and conscience, or a false adherence to what he sardonically called the progressive doctrine. That we leave behind the old verities centered around the conflict between good and evil and truth and falsehood, and replace them by a spurious, if tempting, distinction between progress and reaction.
În 1989 am constatat că după prăbușirea comunismului, care într-un fel o împlinire a gândirii lui Comte, prin Karl Marx, în loc să ne întoarcem la religia tradițională creștină, care a fost atacată de creștinism, de comunism și de leninism, ne-am trezit, mai ales noi, cei din Europa de Est, cu un soi de exaltare excesivă a științei pozitive, a gândirii utilitariste, dovadă că pentru cei de la Bruxelles de multe ori sufletul oamenilor nu mai contează. Avem doar, din păcate, o prezentare a bătăliilor pe care națiunile trebuie să le dea în termen de tradiție versus progres. Ori, spune profesorul Mahoney, dacă e să ne uităm la adevărații profeți ai modernității, și doi autori sunt importanți, Fyodor Mihailovici Dostoevski și Alexander Solzhenitsyn pentru această discuție, constatăm că în gândirea acestor conservatori creștini, bătălia care se dă nu este între națiuni, nu este nici măcar între ideologii, ci bătălia adevărată, cea mai importantă care se dă, este în inimile noastre. E bătălia între bine și rău, între adevăr și minciună, între frumusețe și urâțenie. Ori această redescoperire a sufletului omenesc ca un loc unde se iau cele mai importante decizii este esențială și de aceea trebuie să ne ancorăm în operele acestor mari gânditori conservatori pentru a descoperi care este sensul vieții noastre și care este adevărata bătălie care merită câștigată.
And so for Solzhenitsyn, of course, the totalitarian regime was an implacable enemy of liberty and human dignity, of the human spirit, and it had to be fiercely resisted. So in the Gulag Archipelago, Solzhenitsyn pays tribute to Georgy Tenno, the committed escaper who escaped from the camps 10 or 12 times, was put in solitary confinement but escaped again and again. He pays tribute to prisoners who rose up in Kangir, took over a camp for 40 days, and he says, for 40 days, for the first time ever, we saw self-government in Russia, in a concentration camp in the spring of 1954. So always paid tribute to those who engaged in what he called an active struggle against evil. At the same time, he said, it was possible, even in the concentration camps, to experience spiritual ascent. And for Solzhenitsyn, the crucial act was everyone came to a fork in the road. Would they survive at any price? And Solzhenitsyn added, that always meant at the expense of another human being. Or would they maintain their personal integrity come what may? And that opened up certain spiritual possibilities. And I'm coming to the end, but I'll say there are two great chroniclers of the camp experience under communist totalitarianism in the Soviet Union. Solzhenitsyn, the author of the much more famous 3-volume Gulag Archipelago, but Varlam Shalamov, the author of Kolyma Tales. And he spent 25 years in Kolyma in the Russian Northeast. It was minus 60 degrees in the mines. He miraculously survived. But Shalamov, who was a Trotskyite, entered the camp a nihilist and came out of the camp as a nihilist. He said, the camps did nothing for anybody. No one was improved. Everyone, what the camps did, the experience of the camps did, is they confirmed the belief truth that we live in a godless world, a soulless world, a world without hope. He's a great chronicler of the camps, but Solzhenitsyn says, I met tens of thousands of Zeks. They were all unique personalities. And he said, those who came into the camps uncorrupted, with the spirit of integrity, generally left the camps uncorrupted and with the spirit of integrity. And by the way, Shalamov made one exception. He said he had to admit that the religious believers, the criminals and other called the women believers, were particularly characterized by moral rectitude. They called them nuns, like religious sisters, but he said they were the least corruptible. So even Shalamov recognized that there was a group of people who were intent on maintaining their fidelity to conscience and truth. In any case, what's the implication for all this today? Let's say for those of us who live in productivist Western democracies. I think for Solzhenitsyn, the lesson is don't forget that we're ensouled persons. Don't forget that the spiritual life can be challenged by the everyday preoccupation with material gain or with partisan conflict. Not that these things are avoidable, not that there's some spiritualist utopia that we ought to aim at, but somehow we who live in the free societies, we have to make an active effort to live lives in freedom where we nonetheless maintain our spiritual integrity. Solzhenitsyn gave a great speech at the Hoover Institution in 1976. He was there to research one of his books during his forced exile in the West. And he spoke about the shallowing of freedom. And he said, rule of law is a very good and great thing, but a kind of corrupt legalism isn't. And somehow the shallowing of freedom is when you confuse the irresponsible exercise of freedom with somehow the flourishing of human autonomy. And those messages of Solzhenitsyn in 76 at Hoover, at Harvard in 78, were confused with the spewings of a Russian reactionary. Richard Pipes compared it to Puba-Donetsov, the grand procurator of the Orthodox Church under Tsar Nicholas. He was saying nothing of the sort. He was saying what the best Western thought had long said. There is no freedom without personal integrity and responsibility. We have free will, and we need to turn, as Solzhenitsyn put it in a 1993 speech, we need to turn progress, because technical and scientific progress is never necessarily moral progress, and sometimes can be its diametric opposite. But we have a responsibility to exercise our freedom and to live in a progressive society in a way where we self-consciously try to perpetrate the good. Thank you.
Mulțumim foarte mult. Thank you very much, Professor Mahoney. I'll just briefly say the last 2 or 3 ideas you've articulated so eloquently. profesorul Mahoney vede în Solzhenitsyn un reper, pentru că Solzhenitsyn a trăit drama comunistului dezamăgit, care în tinerețe a respins religia creștină, l-a citit pe Marx, apoi, ajungând în închisoare, și-a pus o întrebare fundamentală. Mă salvez aici pe mine, aruncându-l pe fratele meu în suferință, sau am demnitate și curaj și mă salvez pe mine fără să-l arunc pe cel de lângă mine în iadul acesta al Gulagului. Ceea ce constată Solzhenitsyn, dinpreună cu Shalamov, autorul mai degrabă nihilist al povestirilor din Colâma, este că cei care au pătruns în închisoare, și aici profesorul Sorin Lavric știe mai bine ca oricine ce înseamnă această mărturie a celor care au trecut prin închisoare, cei care au pătruns în închisorile comuniste, înzestrați cu har și credință în Dumnezeu, au rezistat mult mai nobil și mai demn la presiunile făcute de regim decât cei care au pătruns în închisoare sceptici și neconsolați. Trăim în vremuri de relativă prosperitate, ne spune profesorul Mahoney din Statele Unite. Trăim în vremuri însă și de superficialitate. Și poate că e timpul să ne dăm seama că progresul tehnic nu e niciodată un progres moral. Că viața spirituală este mult mai valoroasă decât existența materială și că libertatea fără integritate și fără responsabilitate nu e decât o sclavie ascunsă. Încă o dată mulțumim profesorului Mahoney.